Late evening, Memphis, 1951. A narrow hallway in a vocational school lies nearly deserted, lit by a single flickering bulb. At the far end stands a thin boy with a too long black fringe and a pink shirt neatly folded over his arm, the one his mother stitched by hand from leftover cloth. He holds a cheap guitar, tight against his chest, the wood scraped from years of practice no one ever heard. A door slams somewhere behind him, sending a sharp echo down the corridor. Then, the laughter. Low at first, then rising. 3 older boys step into view, their shadows stretching ahead of them. One stops inches from his face. "Back in those girly clothes again, Presley? With that hair? You won't get anywhere looking like that, except maybe home to cry." The boy lowers his gaze. His fingers tighten around the guitar neck. He has 2 choices: run like he always has, or stay. Stay, even if his voice shakes. Stay, even if his knees tremble. He breathes once, and for the first time, he chooses not to move. The lights hum. The hallway settles. A single uncertain note escapes the guitar, small enough to disappear, bold enough to begin something the world isn't ready for. No one in that hallway knows it yet. But the sound they just mocked is about to rearrange the future. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. He felt the whispering before he heard it, the kind that slid along the hallway walls long before words formed clearly. Locker doors slammed, sneakers scraped across old linoleum, and somewhere behind him a snicker rose like steam from a kettle. Elvis kept walking, one hand brushing the pomade-slicked ridge of hair that always seemed to draw the most attention. The shine from it caught the overhead lights and made a thin glint that students used as an excuse to aim their mockery directly at him. "Hey, Greasetop!" someone murmured loud enough for the crowd to enjoy. Another voice joined in, older, deeper, rehearsed. "Your mama polished that with motor oil?" He didn't turn around. He learned months ago that turning only fed them. Still, the words hit the same spot every time, tightening behind his ribs like a knot pulled too hard. His shirt, the one his mother had sewn from leftover fabric, held colors slightly too bold for a Memphis high school boy of 1951. Reds that should have been darker, stitching that betrayed how many evenings his mother worked under a single dim bulb. The fabric wrinkled under his fingertips as he clutched the strap of his books. The hallway smelled of chalk, old paper, and the metallic hint of radiator pipes. Familiar, but never comforting. He tried to slip into music class unnoticed, but the room fell silent for a beat as he stepped through the door. Eyes drifted toward his hair first. Jet, glossy, shaped carefully by hands that hoped their son could look sharp, even if the family lived in a cramped room 2 streets from the river. Then the smirks appeared, small as scratches on glass. Mr. Porter, the music teacher, tapped his baton against the piano with a few impatient clicks. He wasn't cruel, just tired, and tired men sometimes mistook indifference for discipline. "Elvis," he said, not lifting his eyes fully. "You know they're going to keep laughing as long as you insist on showing up looking like this." The word "this" hung in the air like dust in sunlight, visible, heavy, and impossible to ignore. A few boys stifled laughter. One failed and let out a sharp bark. Elvis swallowed. He wished the floorboards would open and take him, but he forced his breath steady. He had hoped, naively, that a music teacher of all people would understand something about expression. Instead, Porter's comment carved a deeper groove than the teasing from students ever could. Adults were supposed to know better. Adults were supposed to defend the ones struggling to find their footing. Instead, he heard, "You brought this on yourself." He lowered into his chair quietly. The ache behind his eyes wasn't sadness. It was a slow humiliation, the kind that settled in the bones and made everything feel heavier. Class dragged. Notes swelled from the piano but couldn't reach him. His mind drifted back home. The one-room place with peeling wallpaper, the smell of fried cornmeal lingering from the night before, his father's boots drying by the heater after another day of uncertain work, his mother humming while stitching new cuffs onto shirts that had already lived too many lives. Nothing in that small space felt shameful until the world outside decided it should be. When the bell finally rang, he gathered his books quickly. Students spilled out, conversation rising like a flood. He stepped into the corridor hoping to blend into the flow. But then he felt a tug. So soft, he almost missed it. A folded scrap of paper slipped into his hand. He turned. A girl from class, quiet, reserved, always sitting near the window, met his eyes only for a heartbeat, before looking away and moving down the hall. She had never spoken to him directly, never joined in the teasing either. He unfolded the note carefully, expecting another cruel joke. Maybe something written softly enough that the writer could deny it later. Instead, in small, nervous handwriting, "Don't change your hair. You're not like the others. And that's good." His breath caught. No signature, no embellishment. Just a sentence from someone brave enough to say what she could not speak aloud. The hallway blurred around him. For the first time that day, something loosened in his chest. Not confidence exactly, but a spark of something steadier. Someone had noticed him not as a target, but as a person. He tucked the note into his pocket as though it were glass. At home that evening, the world shrank back to the narrow room they lived in. A single lamp cast golden light on the table where a simple supper waited. His mother hummed again while mending a sleeve. The rhythm of needle through fabric echoed like tiny footsteps across cloth. Elvis sat on the edge of the bed, the only bed, and reached for the battered guitar leaning against the wall. He didn't pick it up to dream of a stage or a crowd. He wasn't ready for fantasies. He held it because something inside him, bruised from the day, needed to push back gently. A slow chord rang out. The sound felt rough, unfinished, just like him. He tried another, then a short progression he'd heard at church years earlier. The music didn't fix anything, didn't erase the smirks or the teacher's dismissive voice. What it did was simpler. It anchored him. As long as he could make a sound of his own, the world couldn't silence everything. He realized, somewhere between the third and fourth chord, that if people had already decided he didn't belong, then he no longer had anything to lose by continuing to be himself. The knot in his chest finally loosened. Outside, Memphis hummed with night sounds. Streetcars rattling in the distance, radios murmuring through open windows, the river carrying its slow, steady breath. Inside that cramped room, a boy kept strumming, unaware that the small, private decision he made in that moment would echo far beyond the walls that tried to contain him. If they wouldn't accept him anyway, then he would follow the one thing that still felt true. And he played on, fingers trembling but certain, as the first quiet shift of his life began. He had promised himself he wouldn't tremble this time. The school's small auditorium wasn't even half full. Just a scatter of students who stayed after class because they were curious, bored, or eager for entertainment at someone else's expense. The wooden stage creaked beneath his shoes as he stepped onto it, clutching the guitar he had practiced on the night before. A thin beam of afternoon light slipped through the tall windows, highlighting floating dust like drifting snowflakes. Elvis cleared his throat. His palms felt damp against the worn wood of the guitar. He didn't look at the audience. He focused on the microphone that barely worked, the cord twisting like a stubborn vine. He heard whispers. Not loud, just enough to remind him that quiet cruelty could travel further than shouting. He strummed the first chord. The sound wavered, but held together. His voice followed, soft, uncertain, yet carrying a warmth that came naturally when he wasn't trying to impress anyone. For a moment, the room steadied. A few heads turned. A girl in the second row leaned forward, as if the notes surprised her. Then someone laughed. Not because he missed a note, not because his voice faltered, but because of his hair. Look at him, trying to sing with that fancy shine on his head, a boy muttered, loud enough for the rest to hear. The laughter spread quickly, bouncing off the walls like thrown pebbles. The rhythm of it drowned his second verse before it left his throat. His fingers froze on the strings. He stood there, suspended in that awful space between trying again and admitting defeat. The teacher supervising the event didn't intervene. He simply checked his watch, waiting for the moment to pass, as though this humiliation was predictable, routine. Elvis stepped back from the mic. No anger rose, just a coldness so sharp it felt almost clean. He walked off stage quietly, the unfinished song settling into silence behind him. As he slipped out of the auditorium, he told himself he wouldn't cry. Not here. Not where the walls remembered every embarrassment. The air outside offered little comfort. Memphis heat wrapped around him with its heavy, late-afternoon weight. He found himself drifting downtown, guitar slung across his back like something fragile he needed to protect. He didn't plan where he was going. His feet carried him past storefronts, neon signs, and the rumble of passing buses. By the time he reached Beale Street, the sky had deepened to a rich blue, and the humidity carried the smell of barbecue smoke and river wind. The place vibrated with music, not the stiff kind from school assemblies, but living sound, guitars sliding into blues patterns, drums tapping like restless fingers, horns calling out conversations that couldn't be spoken plainly. People gathered in small groups outside the clubs, listening, arguing about musicians, tapping their shoes on the cracked sidewalk. Elvis stopped in front of a doorway, where an older guitarist sat on a crate, coaxing notes that felt both worn and fresh. The man's fingers moved with the ease of someone who had played through storms, literal and otherwise. Elvis lingered close enough to hear every bend of the strings. "You look like you're carrying something heavy," the man said without lifting his gaze. Elvis blinked. "Just rough day." "Ain't they all?" the guitarist replied, finally glancing at him. His eyes were sharp, but kind. He nodded toward Elvis's slicked-back hair and the thrifted shirt that still carried the faint scent of his mother's starch. "They rib you for that?" Elvis hesitated. "Pretty much." The man chuckled. Not cruelly, but knowingly. "Listen, son, if they're laughing, it means they noticed you. And if they're trying to copy you later, and they will, that means you're already ahead." Elvis stared at him. The words landed with more weight than the teasing he'd endured earlier. This man didn't admire him, didn't pity him. He simply told the truth in a way that felt like a hand offered, not a push. The guitarist kept playing. Elvis stood there, absorbing the sound, feeling the layers of shame slowly shift into something less binding. The blues didn't hide pain. It shaped it, gave it edges and rhythm. For the first time, he imagined that maybe his hurt had a place in the world too, not as weakness, but as a kind of fuel. A sudden movement across the street caught his attention. A small crowd was gathered near a storefront window where a simple painted sign read, Sun Record Company. Elvis had passed the building before, but never stopped long enough to examine it. Tonight, the windows flickered with warm light, hinting at something private, industrious, important. He walked closer. Inside, he glimpsed shelves of acetate discs, a microphone suspended from the ceiling, and a piano pushed up against the wall. It looked nothing like the stage at school. It looked like a room where sounds were taken seriously. He imagined stepping inside. Just imagined it. His breath lodged in his throat at the thought. Suddenly the door opened, and a tall man, with a stern, thoughtful face, stepped out carrying a stack of papers. Elvis didn't know who he was. Not yet. But he felt the weight of his presence. The man glanced briefly at him, gave a polite nod, and moved on. Elvis remained frozen. He had no idea he'd just stood within arm's reach of Sam Phillips, the man who would one day shape his future. But tonight, Elvis only saw a closed door where a chance had already walked past. The street buzzed with music again, pulling him back into the present. He turned away from the studio and began walking home, each step softened by the echo of a blues guitar behind him, and the quiet conviction that maybe the world held corners where he belonged, even if he hadn't found them yet. Something inside him shifted, small but unmistakable. The world was bigger than Hume's high school, and his voice, shaken, ridiculed, interrupted, was still his. The cold that winter settled deep into the thin walls of their rented room, the kind of cold that made every surface feel like metal. Elvis woke one morning to the sound of his parents whispering. They whispered often, mostly about bills, overdue notices, and how to stretch 1 week's groceries into 2. But today, their voices carried a sharper edge. His father, Vernon, sat with his elbows on the table, staring at the folded letter in front of him. His mother moved quietly around the stove, pretending she didn't notice the silence growing heavier by the second. When Elvis stepped closer, Vernon straightened but didn't lift his eyes. "They let me go," he said simply. The words didn't surprise Elvis, but they landed with a dull thud in his chest. Temporary work was always fragile. One slow week, one supervisor in a foul mood, and it was gone. They had been through this cycle before, but each time it stripped away another layer of certainty. The room felt smaller. The table, the stove, the single window, they all seemed to lean inward. His mother tried to smile. "We'll get by," she murmured, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded a dishcloth. Elvis sensed something shifting inside him. Not panic, but a realization that childhood was slipping away faster than he'd expected. He wanted to ease their burden somehow, even if he barely understood how adulthood worked. When he mentioned looking for work, Vernon gave a dismissive wave. "School first," he said. But the hesitation in his voice betrayed the truth. Extra income from their son wouldn't be unwelcome. A few days later, Elvis found himself at a loading dock on the outskirts of Memphis, surrounded by men who looked carved from the very crates they lifted. Broad-shouldered, weathered, their boots coated with dust from long shifts. The foreman eyed him skeptically, but shrugged. "You can haul small loads," he said. "See if you last a week." The first hour nearly broke him. Boxes seemed intentionally heavy, wooden splinters dug into his palms, and the cold metal frame of the truck stung every time he caught his breath. When he paused to rub his fingers, 2 co-workers chuckled. "Pretty boys already wore out," one muttered. Another glanced at Elvis's carefully combed hair and said, "Bet that shine slides right off once he starts sweating." Elvis forced a thin smile and kept moving. The laughter was familiar. It hurt, yes, but it didn't surprise him. What did surprise him was the older man stacking crates near the back. The man had deep lines around his eyes and a steady, patient rhythm to his work. When Elvis struggled with an oversized box, the man stepped in without making a show of it. "Grip the bottom," he advised quietly. "Let the weight settle before you lift." After the load was secured, he gave Elvis a long look, not mocking, not pitying, simply evaluating. "You keep showing up," he said. "That's what counts. Life doesn't change because you're strong. It changes because you're stubborn." The comment sank deeper than anything Elvis had heard recently. Stubbornness. He knew that feeling. It was the reason he kept practicing guitar late into the night. The reason he endured the laughter at school. The reason he walked Beale Street imagining a place for himself there, even when it felt impossible. That day, when he trudged home with sore shoulders and aching wrists, he felt something unfamiliar. The quiet dignity of earning even a few dollars. His mother kissed his temple as though he'd returned victorious from a battle. But the struggle at home continued. Bills piled up. Meals grew simpler. The walls seemed to absorb every sigh. It was during one of those strained evenings that Elvis found himself walking past Sun Records again. He recognized the building instantly. Its simple brick exterior, the small neon sign, the faint hum of machinery behind the walls. Something in him stirred. A pull he didn't fully understand. The next week, after a long shift at the dock, he stood outside the studio door with $4 wrapped in tissue paper. They were all he could spare. He didn't come to chase a dream. He came to buy a gift for his mother, a record of his own voice, a keepsake she could hold on to, something to brighten their narrow world. He hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of warm electronics and lacquered wood. Acoustic panels lined the small recording room, giving it an almost sacred hush. A young woman at the desk, Marion Kiesker, looked up with polite curiosity. "You here to record a message?" she asked gently. Elvis nodded. "For my mama." She smiled in a way that made the room feel less intimidating and guided him toward the microphone. As he stood before it, the silence seemed to press against him. Not oppressive, but expectant. He adjusted his grip on the guitar and drew a breath. When the first notes of "My Happiness" slipped out, his voice was steady, warm, shaped by long nights of whispered practice. He didn't sing for fame. He didn't imagine this moment leading anywhere. He simply let the sound drift into the air like a small offering. During playback, he listened with a strange mix of embarrassment and pride. There were mistakes, yes, but there was also something honest in the recording, something he hadn't heard in himself before. As he walked out of Sun Records, clutching the tiny lacquered disc, the city felt different. The sky hadn't changed, the streets hadn't brightened, but inside him, a small doorway had opened. It wasn't about music yet. Not really. It was about proving he wasn't broken by the jeers or the long shifts or the cold mornings. He had stepped into that studio for his mother. But he stepped out, carrying the first piece of the life he didn't yet know was waiting for him. The small disc felt almost weightless in his hands, yet Elvis carried it home as if it might shatter from a wrong breath. The cardboard sleeve had softened from the warmth of his fingers by the time he reached the narrow walkway leading to their apartment. Evening shadows stretched along the porch railings, drawing crooked stripes across the steps. Inside, his mother was folding laundry, tiny domestic motions that steadied the room like a heartbeat. "Mama," he said, setting the record gently on the table. "I got something for you." She looked up, surprised. They didn't exchange gifts often. Money rarely allowed for it. When she saw the small disc, her eyebrows lifted in wonder, the creases at the corners of her eyes deepening. For me? What is it? My voice, he said softly. A song. I made it today. She reached for the record with hands that had mended clothes for years, hands that held more tenderness than strength. Elvis set the needle carefully as she eased into her chair, bracing herself for something joyful, something simple. The first notes crackled through the speaker, faint, fragile, but unmistakably him. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Her breathing tightened. He expected a smile, or at least a spark of delight. Instead, her eyes glistened, filling faster than he could interpret. Are those happy tears? He asked. Her answer was a quivering exhale. Elvis, baby, she faltered. The world out there is hard. I don't want it swallowing you whole. He stared at her. Of all the reactions he had imagined, pride, excitement, surprise, this one knocked something loose inside him. She wasn't doubting his voice. She was afraid of what it might cost him. I only wanted to make something nice for you, he whispered. And you did, she assured quickly, clutching his hand. But dreams, they don't just lift you. Sometimes they drag you places you're not ready to go. She wiped her eyes, embarrassed, murmuring an apology he didn't know how to accept. The record spun on, filling the room with a warmth that contradicted the tension settling between them. He sat long after the music ended, feeling both grateful and strangely diminished. If even his mother feared the path he'd stepped onto, how could he trust it himself? Across town, the record he'd left behind at Sun Records sat in a modest stack of acetates, waiting to be filed. Marion Kiesker, clearing her desk that afternoon, lifted it by chance. She remembered the shy young man with the careful manner of someone afraid to overstep. Curiosity nudged her. She placed the disc on the turntable. The room filled with a voice that was neither polished nor trained, but warm and reaching. Something about it made her stop sorting papers. She played the opening again, trying to pinpoint what held her attention. It wasn't power. It wasn't precision. It was the sincerity, perhaps. A kind of unguardedness rare in young singers. When Sam Phillips walked by her desk, muttering about scheduling and trying to light a stubborn cigarette, the melody caught his ear. "What's that?" he asked, pausing. "A boy who came in today," she replied, "recorded a song for his mother." Sam leaned closer, listening. For a few seconds he remained silent, his expression narrowing into thought. "Not bad," he murmured. "Different tone. There's something in there, but he's raw." He straightened, flicking ash into a tray. "Keep the disc. Might listen again later." And that was all. No phone call, no invitation, no hint that this moment would ever matter. The music faded into the steady buzz of studio work as Sam returned to his office, unaware of how close he'd come to the person who would change his professional life, and perhaps the sound of American music, forever. Days passed. Elvis waited for something he couldn't name. A letter, a message, even a rumor. Nothing came. Sun Records might as well have swallowed his voice whole. His mother tried not to mention the record again, but he caught her, looking at it sometimes, touching the sleeve as if it were too delicate to handle fully. Her worry remained tucked behind small smiles and half-swallowed breaths. She supported him. He knew that, but fear had bent her encouragement into caution. On a Saturday morning, Elvis made a choice he didn't announce to anyone. He walked downtown with the last of his savings folded into his pocket. In a storefront window, a simple display advertised clearance suits. Cheap fabric, brighter colors, styles one season too old, but tailored enough to feel like possibility. He stepped inside. The salesman didn't hide his skepticism at the lanky teenager thumbing through jackets he probably couldn't afford. Still, Elvis found a suit. Light gray, with narrow lapels and stitching that wasn't entirely even. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. He handed over nearly every dollar he had. As he carried the box home, he didn't imagine fame or stages or people screaming his name. He imagined only one thing: walking into a room, any room, looking like someone who believed in himself, even if no one else did yet. The weight of the box steadied him. Something inside had shifted again, subtle but permanent. He wasn't buying clothing. He was buying a future he hoped might still be possible. That evening, he set the suit gently on the bed, smoothing the fabric with careful hands. The light from the lamp threw pale reflections along the threads. He didn't know what waited for him. He didn't know if Sun Records would ever remember his name. But he knew this: if he waited for approval, anyone's, he would never move at all. A spark had been lit, unnoticed by almost everyone. Yet in the quiet of that small Memphis room, it glowed bright enough for him to see. The suit didn't feel like armor. It felt like a promise, thin, fragile, but still a promise. Elvis wore it the first night he tried his luck at a small local radio station hosting an amateur showcase. The building sat between a shuttered hardware store and a diner that smelled perpetually of fried onions. The sign outside flickered weakly, buzzing as though protesting another long evening. Inside, the waiting area was narrow, with mismatched chairs lined against the wall. Posters of past contestants were thumbtacked unevenly, faces of hopefuls who'd performed, failed, maybe tried again, maybe vanished into regular life. Elvis stood with his guitar case at his feet, feeling the stiff collar brush his neck. A receptionist glanced at him, and then at her clipboard. "You here for the audition?" "Yes, ma'am." She gave a small, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Leave your name and have a seat. If there's time, they'll call you." He sat. Time passed. Other contestants moved through the hallway, some laughing nervously, some pacing, some radiating the weary confidence of people who had tried this more times than they wanted to admit. Elvis waited, tapping his thumb once against the guitar case every time the door opened. Eventually, a man in a tweed jacket, the station's DJ, stepped into the hall, scanning the list. "All right, that's it for tonight," he announced. "Thank you, folks." Elvis stood instinctively. "Sir, I put my name down." The DJ looked at him with an expression not unkind, but definitively closed. "Son, you seem like a good kid, but we've got a full schedule. And your style." He gestured vaguely toward Elvis's slicked hair and light gray suit. "It's not what our crowd is looking for." The dismissal was gentle, but the impact felt brutal in its ordinariness. No outrage, no spectacle, just quiet rejection, delivered like a fact of nature. That somehow stung more deeply than mockery ever had. Elvis nodded. "I understand." He didn't, not really, but he forced his voice steady and walked outside. The cold night wrapped around him as the door swung shut. He stood on the sidewalk for a long minute, hearing the faint hum of music drifting from inside the studio. The kind of music deemed appropriate, predictable, safe. Not his. His breath left in a slow cloud. For a moment, the weight of all the small failures, the laughter at school, the shift work, the silence from Sun Records, and now this, pressed hard against him. He felt foolish for wearing the new suit, foolish for believing he might earn a place on a stage, any stage. He turned to walk home, but a familiar voice called out behind him. "Elvis! That you?" He looked up. A young man approached, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn jacket. It took Elvis a second to recognize him, an old classmate from Hume's High, one who had once joined the chorus of teasing, though never the worst of them. The young man's expression softened with something like apology. "Man, you look different," he said. "Didn't even know it was you at first." Elvis shrugged. "Just trying something new." His former classmate nodded slowly. "Listen, about back then, people gave you a hard time. I did too. But you know why?" He looked at Elvis with surprising honesty. "It's 'cause you stood out, and nobody knew what to do with that. Some folks get scared when they see someone who doesn't blend in." Elvis didn't know what to say. The words weren't praise, exactly, but they held an unexpected truth that settled gently into him. Hearing them felt like someone had quietly lifted a weight he didn't realize he'd been carrying. They talked for a few minutes, small memories, tentative reconciliation, and then parted ways, the night swallowing the distance between them. The encounter stayed with Elvis as he walked, warming the space that failure had just hollowed out. A week later, while passing through Beale Street, he spotted a familiar face, one of the musicians who had spoken to him months before, the guitarist who understood hardship and rhythm like two sides of the same coin. The man waved him over. "Boy, I've been hearing you got a voice worth listening to," he said. "Why don't you come by the club tonight? We're doing an open round. Might let you try a song." Elvis froze. A real stage, a real audience. He wasn't sure whether to grin or run. "I'd be honored," he said, his throat suddenly dry. That night, the club felt alive with heat and motion. Cigarette smoke curled toward low ceilings, and laughter rose between bursts of music. Elvis stood near the back, guitar in hand, heart hammering. The crowd was almost entirely black, men and women who knew blues the way others knew prayer. He understood the risk of stepping onto that stage. In 1950s Memphis, crossing racial lines wasn't just unusual. It was sometimes dangerous. But he trusted the man who had invited him. The guitarist nudged him forward. "You're up next, son. Show 'em what you got." But when Elvis approached the stage, the club manager intercepted him, eyes narrowing with unease. "You bring him?" he asked the guitarist quietly. "He can sing. Let him try." The manager shook his head, glancing at the audience already buzzing with anticipation. "Not tonight. Folks are in a mood. I'm not risking trouble." Elvis stepped back, heat rising behind his ears. He tried to say it was fine, that he understood, but the words tangled. The rejection wasn't personal. He knew that, but it still sank into him with a sting no one around him could hear. The guitarist gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Not your fault," he said quietly. "Sometimes the world just isn't ready for what's coming." Elvis nodded, though a hollow ache stretched through him as he exited the club. He paused on the street, letting the warm glow of the neon lights wash over him, trying to steady his breath. 3 refusals in a row. 3 doors shut without ceremony. Yet beneath the disappointment, another thread pulled at him. Each no made him want to try again. Not out of pride, but because some part of him felt unfinished. As if music were a sentence he had started, and wasn't yet willing to stop speaking. He adjusted the guitar strap on his shoulder, and continued walking, the night pressing close, but not unwelcome. Something in him had toughened, quietly, like wood cured by heat. If the world wasn't ready for him yet, then he would learn to wait. And waiting, he realized, didn't mean standing still. The summer heat in Memphis didn't settle gently. It pressed down like a heavy hand, thickening the air inside every building. On one such sweltering afternoon, Elvis arrived home dusty from work when the phone rang. Their house rarely received calls, Most people who needed them simply knocked on the door. His mother answered with a tentative, "Hello?" before her eyes widened in surprise. "It's for you," she said, covering the receiver as if afraid the voice on the other end might vanish. A woman from Sun Records. His throat tightened. He wasn't expecting anything, certainly not this. When he took the phone, the cord curled around his fingers like a nervous habit. "Hello? Elvis?" A warm, steady voice. Marion Kiesker. "Can you come by the studio this week? Mr. Phillips wants to try a little session with you. Nothing formal. Just a test." A test. The word struck him like a distant bell. Yes, ma'am. I can come." "Good. Bring your guitar." The call ended, leaving the room strangely quiet. His mother stared at him, searching his face. "What do they want?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm gonna find out." When he stepped into Sun Records days later, the air buzzed with the hum of amplifiers warming up. The studio was small, almost cramped, but held a kind of electric stillness, as if sound itself waited patiently in the corners. Sam Phillips stood at the console, sleeves rolled to the elbows, eyes sharp with focus. He offered Elvis a nod rather than a handshake. "Let's see what you can do," he said simply. Elvis felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't the casual message for mama session. This was a room full of expectation. Scotty Moore and Bill Black, musicians Sam trusted, were already tuning their instruments. Elvis swallowed, feeling like a novice among craftsmen. Sam gestured. "Start with something you know well. A ballad, maybe." Elvis positioned the microphone, breathed in, and began a gentle tune. His voice came out softer than he intended, held back by nervousness. He stumbled on a note, tried again. Sam's expression remained neutral, but not encouraging. "Try another," Sam said after a moment. Elvis shifted his weight and attempted a second ballad, then a third. His palms slicked with sweat. The room seemed to shrink around him. Sam leaned back in his chair, tapping a pencil against the console with slow, controlled impatience. "Something is missing," his eyes seemed to say. "Something isn't clicking." Elvis felt embarrassment creeping up his neck. The sting of wasted opportunity tightened his throat. He wondered if he should apologize, tell them he wasn't ready, that he didn't know how to be the singer they wanted. Sam rubbed his forehead. "Let's take a break." The words landed with a dull heaviness. Scotty and Bill exchanged a glance, not unkind but edged with uncertainty. Elvis stepped aside, pretending to adjust his guitar, though he mostly needed to keep his hands from shaking. He told himself to breathe, told himself not to run. Then something peculiar happened, a moment so small it barely made sense. While pacing to release tension, Elvis began humming an old blues tune he used to fool around with at home. "That's all." "Right, Mama." He strummed it lightly, half for comfort, half out of restless energy. But he didn't play it slow like the original. He sped it up, giving it a bounce he'd never consciously crafted. Bill looked up first. Scotty slowed his adjustments. The room seemed to tilt. Elvis kept going, unaware of the attention gathering around him. The rhythm loosened something inside him. His shoulders relaxed. His voice rose, not timid this time, but bright, textured, alive. Then Sam shot out of his chair. "Hold it!" he barked. "Do that again, exactly like you just did." Elvis blinked, startled. "This? I was just foolin'." "Do it again," Sam repeated, pointing sharply. "Scotty! Bill! Pick it up with him!" Paper rustled, chairs scraped, instruments snapped into readiness. Elvis lifted his guitar again. His heartbeat thundered, but not with fear, something closer to exhilaration. When he launched into the song a second time, Scotty stitched crisp, quick licks over the melody, and Bill slapped the bass with an infectious pulse. The room, moments earlier thick with uncertainty, suddenly vibrated with a wild, raw energy neither structured nor rehearsed. Sam leaned over the console, eyes blazing. "That's it!" he shouted. "Don't think. Just do it." And Elvis did. He threw himself into the music fully, without apology, without hesitation. His voice cracked in places, soared in others, and blended into something he had never heard from himself before. His foot tapped instinctively. His body swayed. Not a performance, just an instinct he could no longer restrain. By the time the final chord hung in the air, the room felt transformed. Even the fluorescent lights seemed brighter. Elvis wiped his brow, uncertain whether he had impressed them or made a fool of himself. "I don't know what that was," he said quietly. Sam stepped forward, the hint of a grin, rare and genuine, forming. "That," he said, "was new, and we're not letting it go. No fanfare, no dramatic speech, just a clear-eyed recognition of possibility." Elvis felt the ground steady beneath him in a way he'd never known. The failed ballads, the stumbles, they no longer mattered. What mattered was this sudden alignment of chance, instinct, and readiness. He had come expecting nothing. Yet in a moment, born from frustration, from nervous energy, from a boy's quiet rebellion against silence, the sound that would change his life had arrived. Uninvited, unexpected, undeniable. And the world, though it didn't know it yet, had begun to shift with him. The night "That's All Right" hit the airwaves, Memphis breathed differently. It was July, thick with heat, swollen with insects humming in the trees. And inside the cramped WHBQ radio studio, DJ Dewey Phillips tapped a cigarette against the table while the record spun beneath his fingertips. He'd played thousands of songs in his time, but this one tugged at him before the first chorus finished. It carried a kind of electricity no one could name, the sound of a familiar world turning slightly out of place. He didn't wait for the needle to lift before shouting toward the glass window separating him from the switchboard. "Spin it again," he barked. "Phones are already lighting up." And indeed they were. First one line, then two, then all six at once. The phone bulbs flared bright like a row of tiny suns. His assistant, startled, grabbed the nearest receiver. "WHBQ, you're on the line." "Yes, we'll play it again." "Please hold." "WHBQ, hello?" Voices tumbled over each other. "Who is that boy? Where did he come from? Put the song back on. What's his name? Play it again." Dewey grinned at the noise, tapping his foot as the second play began. The studio walls shook with the response. This wasn't polite curiosity. This was a spark catching dry timber. But for every caller praising the song, another came in hot with anger. "That's a colored singer, isn't it?" a man demanded. "We don't need that sound on white stations," another argued. "What are you pushing, Dewey?" Dewey leaned into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, the young man on this record is a homegrown Memphis boy. And if you're asking who he sings like, well, he sings like himself." He left the rest unsaid. Let the city draw its own conclusions. Across town, Elvis didn't know any of this yet. He sat in the narrow living room of their modest apartment, the lamp flickering slightly with each shift in power. A neighbor had yelled from the porch an hour earlier, "Elvis, turn on WHBQ! They're playing something of yours." He and his parents gathered around the radio, the air between them tense with disbelief. When his voice cracked through the speaker, warmer, fuller, somehow bolder than he remembered, it startled even him. His mother covered her mouth. "That's you," she whispered, as if the realization frightened her. His father nodded slowly, stunned. Our boy, he murmured, almost to himself. But Elvis couldn't fully absorb their reactions. His pulse raced, not with pride, but with a strange panic. If people recognized him? If they mocked him? If they tore down what he'd only just begun to build? Then the phone rang. He jumped. His mother startled. His father reached it first. "It's for you, son." Elvis took the receiver with trembling fingers. "Hello?" Dewey's voice barreled through, enthusiastic and breathless. "Elvis, where on God's earth have you been? I've been trying to track you down. You're blowing up the phones over here." Elvis blinked hard. I am? You bet. Get down here if you can. Folks want to hear from you." Elvis stammered something resembling agreement. The call ended, leaving him staring at the silent receiver. His mother placed a hand on his cheek, her thumb smoothing a crease that nervousness had carved into his expression. "You go," she said softly. "People want to hear you. That's a blessing, even if it's scary." He nodded, though fear still clung to him. He put on his suit, the same cheap, light gray one he'd bought to look professional, even though it made him feel like a boy pretending to be a man. Then he rushed through the warm Memphis dusk toward the station. When he entered WHBQ, the studio felt like a hive buzzing at full tilt. Dewey waved him in with both arms. "Sit here," he commanded. "We're going live." Elvis froze. "Live?" Dewey laughed. "Don't worry, just be yourself." But being himself had never been simple. He sat down, smoothing his palms against his legs. Dewey flicked the microphone switch, and the red on-air light flared above them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dewey announced, leaning back with theatrical ease, "you've been calling all night wondering who this singer is. Well, he's sitting right here. Elvis Presley." The name felt almost foreign, spoken aloud like that. Elvis managed a greeting, voice wavering at the edges. Callers immediately poured through the lines. Some wanted to praise him. Some wanted to know what church he sang in. Some demanded to know his race. Dewey fielded the harsher questions with practiced deflection, steering the conversation toward music, hometown roots, the story of the recording session. Through it all, Elvis spoke quietly but sincerely. He didn't brag. He didn't posture. He simply answered with the cautious grace of someone who never expected to be noticed. Dewey studied him with growing admiration. The boy was overwhelmed, yes, but he wasn't crumbling. Back home, his parents listened to the broadcast with a mix of awe and anxiety. His mother clasped her hands against her chest, alternating between smiling and swallowing her nerves. She could already sense the world pulling her son toward something vast and unpredictable. His father sat straighter than usual, chin lifted, pride settling across his face like morning light. When Elvis finally returned home near midnight, still stunned, his mother hugged him tightly. "They loved you," she whispered into his shoulder. He wasn't sure whether that truth comforted or terrified him. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, one realization settled with clarity. The city now knew his voice. And the city could not agree on what to do with it. Some were thrilled, others unsettled, a few outright furious, but none of them ignored him anymore. For a boy who had been dismissed, mocked, overlooked, this shift felt enormous, dangerous, beautiful. Whatever door had opened, he sensed it couldn't be closed again. And somewhere between fear and excitement, between doubt and possibility, he felt the first true spark of destiny warming in his chest. The first time Elvis stepped onto a packed stage after the radio breakthrough, the world around him seemed to pulse. It wasn't a grand theater or a polished venue, just a modest club on the outskirts of Memphis, its neon sign flickering like a tired heartbeat. Inside, the air hung heavy with cigarette smoke, perfume, sweat, and anticipation. Bill Black slapped his bass experimentally, while Scotty Moore tightened a string, glancing at Elvis every few moments. They sensed his nerves. They had felt the same shock when the phone began ringing off the hook with requests for shows. Everything had shifted faster than any of them could articulate. Elvis stood near the narrow backstage door, gripping his guitar as though anchoring himself. The cheap suit clung to him in the heat, but he didn't dare remove the jacket. He kept adjusting the collar, smoothing the sleeves, as though order in the fabric could calm the disorder inside him. Beyond the curtain, the crowd murmured like a restless tide. People leaned forward in their chairs. Teenagers clustered near the front, faces lit like lanterns. Adults sat with crossed arms, skepticism visible even in silhouette. "They're here for the sound," Bill whispered. "Not the look. You'll be fine." Elvis nodded, but didn't believe him. The memory of the laughter at school, the rejection at auditions, the silence of empty rooms, they all pressed close, whispering doubts louder than the people cheering his name outside. Then someone from the club staff poked his head backstage. "You boys ready?" Scotty nudged Elvis gently. "Time to go." Elvis swallowed hard and stepped forward. The moment he crossed the threshold into the stage light, the room erupted, shouting, clapping, a burst of unfiltered excitement that hit him like a physical force. He froze for a split second, unable to reconcile the sound with reality. Then Bill counted off the opening number, and instinct shoved Elvis into motion. He sang the first lines steadily, though his heartbeat thudded against the rhythm. Then something unexpected happened. His leg twitched. Nerves. Pure nerves. The tremor moved through him before he could suppress it. The crowd gasped. A few girls shrieked. His knee jerked again, then his hip, then his entire posture shifted into something loose, rhythmic, almost dangerous. He hadn't planned any of it, but once it started, he couldn't stop. His body responded to the music with a force he didn't understand. His voice grew stronger, carrying grit and brightness in equal measure. Scotty's guitar lines wrapped around him like guiding rails, and Bill's bass thumped a heartbeat he could follow, even blindfolded. The audience exploded, literally screamed. Young women clapped their hands to their mouths. Boys nudged each other, stunned. Even the skeptical adults leaned forward, trying to decode what they were witnessing. Not everyone approved. In the back corner, a pair of middle-aged couples frowned, whispering sharply. A man shook his head, muttering something about propriety. A woman shifted uneasily, as though the performance violated an unspoken boundary. But Elvis didn't see them. Not yet. He felt only the wave of energy engulfing him. His movements became sharper, more confident. Not showmanship, but surrender. He let go of the careful restraint he'd carried for years. Every taunt, every dismissal, every quiet insult dissolved beneath the roar of people who weren't laughing anymore. They were captivated. When the first song ended, the applause crashed like thunder against the low ceiling. Elvis stared at the crowd, chest heaving, sweat trickling beneath his collar. He didn't know how to respond. He didn't know how to absorb admiration. It felt foreign, almost frightening. He looked to Scotty and Bill for help. Both were grinning. "Do another," Scotty mouthed. So he did. Song after song, the room vibrated with electric chaos. A girl fainted. Another climbed onto a chair to see better. The stage floor trembled beneath stomping feet. Someone near the bar yelled, "This boy's out of his mind, and I like it." But for every cheer, resistance grew louder too. A stern-faced man marched to the club manager, demanding to know why this wild-eyed, hip-shaking nonsense was allowed on stage. A local reporter scribbled furious notes, already drafting tomorrow's condemnation. Elvis didn't hear those conversations, but he felt the tension rising, the odd mixture of celebration and outrage. It clung to the edges of the spotlight like a second shadow. When the set ended at last, the crowd surged toward the stage, calling his name, reaching for his hand, asking where he came from. Elvis backed away, overwhelmed, dizzy from adrenaline and disbelief. Backstage, he collapsed against the wall, gulping air. "What just happened?" he asked, voice cracking. Bill laughed. "You just shook the room apart, that's what." Scotty wiped his forehead with a towel. "Never seen anything like it. Don't think Memphis has either." Before Elvis could respond, Sam Phillips strode in, face lit with an intensity that bordered on unsettling. He looked at Elvis, as though seeing not a boy from a run-down neighborhood, but a horizon bursting open. "That reaction out there," Sam said, pointing toward the muffled roar of the crowd. "That's not luck. That's a shift. And shifts scare people." Elvis lowered his gaze, unsure whether he should apologize for the chaos. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Sam stepped closer. "Listen to me. They're going to try to pin you down, tell you your voice is too this, your moves too that, your sound too colored, too loud, too fast, too different." His voice dropped into something harsher, truer. "They will try to break you because they don't understand you." Elvis swallowed. "So what am I supposed to do?" Sam held his stare. "You keep going. You push harder. They can't stop change. Not if it's honest." The words hit Elvis like a slow, steady drumbeat. He wasn't just singing anymore. He was standing at the edge of something larger, something he hadn't asked for but couldn't walk away from. As they packed up the equipment, the noise from the crowd still echoed faintly, like waves hitting distant rocks. Elvis felt both exposed and lifted, terrified and alive. He had arrived as an uncertain young man in a cheap gray suit. He left as something else entirely. Not yet a star, not yet a symbol, but unmistakably, inevitably, on his way to becoming one. By early 1955, Elvis's world had sped up so quickly, he often felt as though he were running to catch himself. One week he was performing in tiny halls with uneven floors and buzzing speakers. The next, he was being pushed onto bigger stages in towns he'd never heard of. Road maps littered the dashboard of the battered car he traveled in. Coffee in cold paper cups became supper more often than he liked. Sleep came in thin fragments. And then came the man who would change everything again. Colonel Tom Parker. Parker didn't approach Elvis the way others had. He didn't ask to hear a song. He didn't comment on the hair, the moves, or the murmurs of controversy. He simply watched him perform one night from the edge of a crowded auditorium, arms folded, expression unreadable. When the show ended and the applause still shook the walls, Parker stepped forward with a certainty that unnerved Elvis. "You're not meant for these little places," Parker said without introduction. "You belong on a bigger stage, and I can get you there." The promise hung in the air like a whistle from a distant train. Beckoning, dangerous, irresistible. Elvis didn't commit immediately. But within weeks, Parker was arranging tours, bookings, and contracts with a speed that felt impossible. Suddenly, Elvis was spending more time on the road than at home. The miles blurred. Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, back to Tennessee, then out again. Crowds grew, screams sharpened. Newspaper writers struggled to categorize him. Some claimed he was a phenomenon, others a menace. Through it all, Elvis did what he had always done. He sang, he moved, he tried not to think too much. But as the year marched on, the distance from home began to ache. He missed the quiet hum of the tiny apartment, the way his mother hummed while ironing, the smell of cornbread warming the kitchen, the old chair where his father read the paper in silence. Those simple things felt farther away each time he boarded another bus. When Parker finally arranged a short gap in the schedule, Elvis packed his bag with relief. The trip home felt like slipping into old clothes. Still familiar, still comforting, despite all that had changed. His mother met him at the door before he could knock. She held him tight, gripping his jacket as though afraid he might fade if she blinked. Inside, the apartment felt smaller than he remembered, but warmer somehow, alive with memory. On the table sat items she had saved, each one a quiet testament to how far he'd come. His first homemade record, edges slightly worn from being handled too often. His first suit, the cheap gray one, folded carefully despite the fraying seams. And, almost tenderly placed, the bright shirt he'd been ridiculed for wearing in high school, the one she had sewn from leftover fabric, never imagining it would become part of a story, reaching beyond their street. She touched the shirt gently. "I kept this because it reminds me of the boy you were," she said softly. "The one who tried so hard to look nice, even when we didn't have much." Elvis felt the words land deep. "Mama, you always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." She shook her head. "No, baby. I was afraid. I didn't want the world to hurt you. But you didn't lose yourself out there." Her voice wavered. "That's what I'm proud of." The room grew still. No grand declarations, no shining spotlight, just mother and son, speaking truths they had been carrying quietly for years. His father joined them, resting a hand on Elvis's shoulder with a weight that conveyed more support than words could. "You're doing all right, son. Don't let anybody tell you different." For a rare moment, Elvis allowed himself to feel anchored, to breathe without worry about schedules or critics or expectations. But the world didn't pause for long. 2 days later, just as he was packing to leave for the next run of shows, the phone rang. His mother answered, then turned toward him with a stunned expression. "Elvis, it's a big station. They want you. Some national show." Elvis stood still, suitcase half-zipped. A national station. Not regional, not local. Nationwide. He took the phone slowly, as though afraid the offer might burst if he moved too quickly. "Yes, sir. This is Elvis Presley," he said, voice low. The voice on the other end confirmed what he could hardly believe. They wanted him on an upcoming broadcast. Real exposure. Real audience numbers. A stage larger than anything he'd dreamed during those long, lonely rehearsals in the tiny room they rented. When he hung up, he didn't speak immediately. He walked outside into the Memphis night, letting the screen door creak shut behind him. The street was dim, quiet, breathing the heavy warmth of a southern evening. It looked almost exactly as it did the nights he'd trudged home from school. Shoulders slumped, pockets empty, guitar knocking against his leg, shame clinging like a second skin. He walked slowly, tracing his old path. Past the corner where boys once jeered, past homes with radios buzzing softly through open windows, past the familiar bend that led to Hume's High School. He paused in front of the building. The windows were dark now, the playground empty, the hallways silent. He remembered standing inside those walls, hearing laughter behind him. He remembered carrying notes from a kind girl who believed in him when he barely believed in himself. He remembered the teacher who told him he brought mockery upon himself by daring to look different. And for the first time, none of those memories hurt. He felt only gratitude for the fragile, uncertain boy who refused to bow his head. The wind tugged softly at his jacket. Somewhere far off, a car radio played a song he recognized. His own voice carried faintly across the night. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his chin triumphantly. He simply breathed, letting the truth settle quietly. He had survived the ridicule. He had endured the doubts. He had found his sound. And now, the world was calling for more. He turned toward home. No fanfare, no cheering crowds, just the steady footsteps of a young man walking into a future he was finally ready to claim. The boy they'd mocked was gone. The man they couldn't stop was just beginning.